Live.
Hi everyone, welcome to the 10th Degrowth talk. My name is Eva and I'll be facilitating today's panel, which is titled Building Degrowth Strategies for Cities. Behind the screen, there's also a great team, so I would like to thank Gabriela, who will be live tweeting, Oksana, who is taking care of the chat and the questions, and Lorenzo, who will be taking care of all technicalities. I'm also, of course, very excited to welcome our three speakers, Kim Carlotta von Schönfeld. Hi, Kim. Dalia, Milían, Bernal. Hi, Dalia. And Paul Chatterton. Hey, Paul. Hey. During their presentations, they will explore how degrowth can help making visible the entanglements between capitalist growth and urban processes, and thus explore how degrowth can help thinking strategies for deep, sustainable, and just change in urban environments in terms of planning, governance, mobility, and housing, among others. In the second part of the talk, we will open the discussion with your questions to the speakers, so please feel free to ask them from now on in the YouTube chat. We expect the talk to last for about 90 minutes. And the last thing before we get started, you can already find in the description of the talk a list of resources provided by each speaker for further content related to their presentations. So without further delay, I'm really happy to introduce our first speaker, Kim Carlotta von Schönfeld. Kim is a PhD candidate in urban planning at Wageningen University Research in the Netherlands. Her PhD explores critical approaches to social learning and social innovation in co-creative planning. She's interested in the power of learning in both challenging and maintaining the status quo, the benefits and drawbacks of participatory forms of planning, and more generally, the possible pathways to inclusive and sustainable futures. In search of possibilities for this, she has engaged in the field of post-growth and degrowth, seeking ways to connect the socio-economic insights of related movements with planning, research, and practice. So she will lay the foundation of our discussion by building the bridge between urban planning and degrowth. The floor is yours, Kim.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for this opportunity to share some insights. I hope I can do justice to what you just introduced. I'll move without further ado to the presentation by sharing my screen. Hopefully this will go as planned. So I would like to briefly introduce this kind of question of the relationship between planning and degrowth. Just to clarify briefly beforehand, I'm using the term degrowth. There are many that prefer the term post-growth. I think there are many sources, places where this is further discussed, and I think it is a worthwhile discussion, but one that I prefer not to go into in detail here. I do provide some resources at the end of the presentation for those interested in reading up a bit more about that difference and discussion. But without further ado, planning and growth. So to reach planning and degrowth, I wanted to give a brief intro to kind of how the pro-growth narrative and planning have been entangled. This looks very complex. I can refer also to the paper that I recently published with Antonio Ferreira below here, which explains it further. But I think I share it here because it really shows how the pro-growth narrative tries to convince us that economic growth is at the center and we will lead basically to overall welfare and thus to ecological sustainability, while economic growth is kind of something that is led to through key instrumental variables that are basically start with a narrative of innovation, which is needed to create new products, which will help commodification, competition, and productivity and efficiency to flourish, and thus to lead to economic growth, overall welfare, and ecological sustainability. So this is kind of the pro-growth narrative that has been very dominant, and which has led the planning practice and planning research as well in the past decades, I would say. And a key way that we see that is basically through several key documents, planning and policy documents, which you see here, for example, already in the early 90s, and then again in 2011, and again now. I think this one, the mission-oriented research and innovation in the European Union, comes from 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And all of them really highlight this idea of growth, innovation-led growth, and kind of trying to lay the emphasis on reaching growth. And this translates basically into practices such as, for example, focusing on the implementation of more high-speed trains and automated vehicles, and really you see the emphasis on high tech, on innovation, on faster modes, making the trains faster and the cars faster and the lanes faster, and really trying to provide more transportation means, more things that can be accessed, etc. And this is really part of this logic that we constantly need more and faster, right? So that things work, and the innovation is supposed to make sure that we do this in a sustainable way. Equal examples could be found in housing and planning for green spaces, in governance, and so forth. I know that the following speakers will also go into some of these at least. And I think what you can look for in there is really the logic of, in the growth narrative of innovation, commodification, competition, and an increase in productivity and efficiency as a package. So not efficiency on its own, but productivity and efficiency as a package, really recurring every time in this logic. While sorry about the complex image here, but in the degrowth version, or the degrowth narrative kind of tries to criticize this idea and tries to unfold or identify some areas in which this is actually flawed, or question at least the relationships that have been shown in the previous image. And you see here that, first of all, social equality comes in as an issue, and overall welfare is seen as something that is dependent on social equality and ecological sustainability. And there are very much questions about whether economic growth leads to social equality, and actually a negation of the fact that economic growth can lead to ecological sustainability due to planetary boundaries. And one of the things that is perhaps most clearly relatable to planning here is, for example, the relationship between commodification and the commons, and seeing that the commons is actually becomes less important and less possible as a solution in planning, because commodification is preferred and will enable basically economic growth to come from those things that are normally, or that could otherwise be seen as part of the commons, that is of those things that are not yet commodified but are used in a community sense, and not necessarily commodifiable uses of things, so on. So to stick kind of to the example from transport, one thing that I think planning has already kind of shown a relationship to values, at least of degrowth, even when there isn't necessarily an explicit mention of degrowth in planning documents or in planning research, what you see is that, for example, with accessibility, this is a basically common discussion in transport studies and in mobility studies, in which we say what we need is access to things, not more mobility or more transport. But of course, in some cases, more mobility or more transport can lead us to reach more things that we would like to reach, such as shops or schools even, or things like that. However, there is actually worth perhaps in questioning not only whether we need accessibility by proximity rather than by more transport, but also to question, do we actually always need more access to things? So do we really need to understand ourselves, understand that we have more, that we basically have access, for example, all of us, to a swimming pool, and say that we need to have an equitable society. Everybody needs to have access to the same things. But what about, for example, if you have an ocean nearby or a lake? Do people that live nearby that really also need a swimming pool in their house, or a swimming pool nearby enough? So there are really these questions that can also be asked and have been asked in planning, and those are very much aligned with views of degrowth. And here on the right, I provide a number of other examples that are discussed by several authors, which I'm not going to go into here in detail due to time, but really there is, in planning, there are many, many things in relation to the commodification, to resisting innovation, bringing back commons, to understanding less is more, so sufficiency in housing, sufficiency in energy. All these things really show that planning has been already engaging for a longer time with ideals of degrowth, even if not always explicitly. And but there are also authors that have shown in planning that there is a certain risk to doing these things, and many of such developments get co-opted or get somehow influenced again by the growth narrative at one point when they seem most successful, really, in terms of trying to make sure that they become profitable and that they become more common and there's more of it. And again, you come into the logic of more. So there is a lot happening, and at the same time, it would make sense to create more of an alliance between planning and degrowth scholarship and probably also many practices to better understand how planning, which is a discipline that engages with how to get somewhere, how to get a vision implemented, how that can be achieved through planning mechanisms. And so avenues for future research and action, in my view, would really be to try to seek a unified approach to planning strategies in favor of degrowth. So if, and that goes together with the second point, working on the acceptability of degrowth strategies in planning, is that if we would find a way to make degrowth, or at least degrowth values, in a set more acceptable in planning and throughout for politics as well, in a way, then it might be easier to unify the kind of approaches and planning strategies that already exist in favor of those values, and to get those to be implemented. Now, I think that this last point relates a bit more to my PhD, and I just briefly wanted to mention, we can go into it perhaps in the discussion if there's time and if anybody is interested, but one thing that is often heralded in planning literature is the idea that we could socially learn from each other to create something more desirable. And one thing that I've found through my research is that normally when we meet other people and we so-called socially learn, so we learn new things, skills, knowledge, understanding, we get understanding through interaction with two or more people, we tend to actually maintain the status quo. So we tend to reinforce those things that we know rather than really seek out something different. Or even a new amalgamation of things that exist and things that are new to us. And an interesting question is then how we can challenge that and how alternatives can nevertheless emerge through also understanding the different practices of people around the world in a way. And I think so this is something worthwhile to explore, also to make this connection between planning and degrowth more explicit and more strong, really. Of course, that trying to influence what we socially learn might be quite a legitimacy issue. And in any case, it is also, like I said, not necessarily the case that within planning we will planners and scholars and practitioners will agree that degrowth is really the way to go, in their opinion. But keep in mind that degrowth is really something that can lead to multiple alternatives. And therefore, maybe some of those at least will be acceptable enough to be implemented. And then we can perhaps go step by step. So I have a number of key references, which I'm just going to leave here. And you can probably pause the video after the presentations to kind of have a look at them. And thanks a lot. I referred to that article I published recently with Antonio Ferreira, and I really would love to have any feedback if you read that or are interested in some more of these topics. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kim. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, to ask you questions on this presentation. It was really, really interesting. Our second speaker, Dalia and Bernal, will bring interesting case studies from Latin American cities where she witnessed a paradox of constant growth and abandonment of infrastructures. Dalia is a doctoral researcher and lecturer in the School of Architecture, Faculty of the Built Environment at Tampere University in Finland. Her current research focuses on the appropriation and transformation of vacant and abandoned urban spaces in the context of Latin America. She's particularly interested in understanding how diverse urban activists strive for and enable societal change through the transformation of urban space. In addition, she's the co-founder of the blog Interrogativa, a platform that brings together and gives voice to women interested in questioning the urban processes that aggravate the social fragmentation and injustices of our cities, that contribute to the depletion of the natural environment, and that exacerbate the climate crisis. Dalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva. And thank you very much to the whole Degrowth teams, and particularly to Katia Pellini, who thought I could contribute to this talk, to this discussion. And special thanks to the women that I'm going to introduce later for sharing their stories with me and revising and commenting this presentation. And I want to start this talk. In the site where these stories begin. And I hope that you can see, because I cannot see. So I want to start in an abandoned plot full of rubble in the middle of Mexico City. It was left after a 22-story high building was demolished following the catastrophic earthquake that struck Mexico City in 1985. The earthquake struck amid the so-called lost decade, a time of economic hardship that took place between 1980 and 1990, in which the social projects and the public enterprises of the Mexican state were carelessly dismantled, and the provision of housing and urban infrastructure was delegated to private hands. So, 27 years later, the rubble had not been collected, the building had not been reconstructed, and its inhabitants had been forever displaced. Now let me take you to San Miguel de Tucumán in Argentina, to the site where another demolished building awaited economic upturn to be transformed into an apartment building. It was one of the thousands of vacant and abandoned plots in the city of Tucumán, several of which are in a legal condition of intestacy. That is, that the owner has died without leaving a will and the property has not been claimed by the next of kin. That is also the case of the next site in the city of San Juan in Puerto Rico, where another house in a condition of intestacy has been abandoned for about 40 years, accumulating a tax debt several times the value of the property. And because it was considered to endanger the safety and the quality of the community, it was declared an estorbo público, a legal condition known in English as public nuisance. This legal condition makes it the municipality's responsibility to either clean, board up, expropriate, or ultimately demolish the property. Let us continue in Puerto Rico, but let's go to Isleta de San Juan, where a house was abandoned after the owner left the island several years ago, as have done hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans that have been devastated by a mixture of natural disasters in the form of hurricanes and earthquakes, as well as man-made disasters, product of its colonial relationship to the United States, the government debt, austerity measures, and as I was told, unleashed neoliberalism. This has prompted waves of mass migration towards the outside of Puerto Rico. So when the relatives of the owner of the abandoned house wanted to claim the property after his death, they just could not pay the accumulated tax and let the property decay. I have just quickly presented 4 sites in 3 different cities in Latin America, and all of them are marked by vacancy and abandonment. And I want to be very clear here that I'm not equating degrowth with shrinking cities, namely cities that underwent stark economic crisis and depopulation. What is at stake here, what I'm talking about here, is that abandonment unfolds in parallel to urban and economic growth. I even dare to claim that in the 21st century, abandonment is systemic and a result of the growth paradigm. There are examples in Mexico, where I come from, where cities have been constructed only to stay empty. To be sure, cities as Huehuetoca and Zumpango, both developed under the program of Ciudades Bicentenario in 2008, have vacancy rates of about 40%. As a whole, according to the 2010 census, Mexico has a vacancy rate of about 15%, Argentina 18%, and after 2017, due to the Hurricane Maria, the vacancy rate is estimated over 20%. So, if vacancy and abandonment are directly or indirectly the result of the growth paradigm, what then is the result of a city constructed under the paradigm of degrowth? And I take really quickly the words of geographer David Harvey, who writes in Rebel Cities, "The right to the city is far more than a right of individual or group access to the resources that the city embodies. It is a right to change and reinvent the city more after our heart's desire." So now let me tell you the stories of 4 women and the way they are shaping cities with their after their heart's desires. I will start with Gabi. Gabi was a photographer. When her daughter was born, urged by her desire to be able to provide her daughter with organic food, Gabi decided to learn as much as possible about urban agriculture and permaculture, until she became a professional sembradora, that is like a grower. She began with little projects here and there until she finally co-founded one of the first centers of urban agriculture in Mexico City called Huerto Romita. Years later, Gabi had managed to obtain some governmental support, not economic support, more of a two thumbs up kind of support. And in 2012, the government let her set a project on an abandoned space in the city. Remember the abandoned space full of rubble? Gabi and her colleagues transformed the abandoned plot into a center of urban agriculture called Huerto Tlatelolco, and then they founded the civil association called Culti Ciudad. Here in Huerto Tlatelolco, Culticiudad grows and sells organic food with the aim to raise awareness about the benefits of local food production, to become a site where knowledge about urban agriculture can be produced and reproduced, and as Gabi told me, to become a place where people are in touch with the life cycles of the food they eat. With her work and dedication, Huerto Tlatelolco has become Gabi's life project, and in her view, Culticiudad is a social project, and Huerto Tlatelolco is a space that transformed her life and make her feel fulfilled. In the final years of her studies in architecture, Veronica had started to notice that her hometown of Tucumán in Argentina had a bunch of abandoned plots. It would not be after studying a master's in design and public space in Barcelona that Veronica would return to Tucumán and systematically begin to document the abandoned sites. She could not help but to imagine what could be of these spaces. After becoming a mother and due to other personal circumstances, however, Veronica started not only to see, but to live the city differently, and has made it her life's project to design universal accessibility in public spaces. In 2017, in collaboration with a university lecturer, she obtained funding from the Bernard Van Leer Foundation to design and build a public plaza dedicated to early childhood. Veronica sought permission from the property owner of a vacant plot to use the space temporarily, asking them, if the space is not economically rewarding, why not make it socially rewarding? Finally, after about 8 months of research, production, and preparation, the plot became Proyecto AUPA, a temporary public space designed to involve children and their caregivers in a qualitative experience of public space. For Veronica, public spaces are an important physical support for everyday life activities that enable collective care, socialization, and encourage mutual aid links. She strongly believes that all vacant and abandoned urban spaces can become important spatial resources that can respond to the lack of public space, even if temporarily. Like Veronica, Marina went to Barcelona to do a master's in urbanism with focus on community planning. Marina returned to Puerto Rico to live in Taft Street in front of the house number 169. In 2013, she joined a group of neighbors, most of them women, to clean the yard of the abandoned house and create a very small huerto that is like a little edible garden. As she told me, the huerto marked a moment of inflection, forcing the community to get out of their houses, go to the street, take care of it, talk, and get to know each other. Then things started to happen, like people donating plants anonymously over the night, or a neighbor harvesting plants and with them preparing food for the community. This was the moment they decided to properly occupy the property. Then they organized cleaning brigades joined by the neighbors, and together they painted the iconic facade of Casa Taft with donated leftover paint. Little by little, the abandoned property had been transformed into what Marina calls a civic center. It became a place to self-organize and a meeting point from which the women could begin to engage and work with community. A few months later, they established the neighborhood association. They registered it as a nonprofit organization. They applied for different funds and continuously established alliances with other groups to take action beyond the house, helping to forge the essence of Casa Taft 169. In 2015, however, the project took an unexpected turn when a law professor and his students joined the project, first helping to clean and paint, but later amending the law 157 approved the 9th of August, 2016. With this new law, the abandoned properties considered public nuisances will be inherited by the municipality, which will grant the University of Puerto Rico 5 months to claim the property. If the university does not claim the property within that time, the municipality can therefore transfer or donate the property to a community-based and non-profit organization to be used for cultural purposes. Actually, Omaira collaborated with Marina in Casa Taft. Omaira is a professor in one of Puerto Rico's schools of architecture, and together with Yasmin and Irmaris, she runs the all-women collective Taller Creando Sin Encargos. The aim of the collective is to join other initiatives and communities to transform urban spaces collaboratively. Moreover, The process of research, design, and production is always linked to an academic exercise in which students are strongly encouraged to collaborate with the community to co-produce a meaningful, sometimes temporary, urban space. The all-women collective had been following the work of Brigada Puerta de Tierra, a collective of artists and children that had occupied an abandoned building and transformed it into a small community garden they called Plaza Vivero. They learned that the building occupation had been a rebellious act against a huge urban redevelopment project that directly affected the community of Puerta de Tierra. The result was the construction of fast bus lanes with traffic lights and zebra lines were forever removed, and new bus stops lacking a place to sit or in protection from the sun were repositioned without any apparent logic. To illustrate her point, Omaira told me one of the bus stops had been placed in front of an entrance of a store, making it impossible for the doors to open. It is within this context that in 2017, Taller Creando Sin Encargos joined forces with Brigada Puerta de Tierra to organize the second workshop of Arquitecturas Colectivas, or collective architectures, and in collaboration with the community, volunteers, and a multidisciplinary group of university students, they designed and built a bus stop on the site of Plaza Viveros. So now I have presented 4 inspiring studies that emerge in the abandoned interstices of different Latin American cities. But what can we learn from these apparently small interventions? I think that first and foremost, that we have to see and understand cities differently. We must stop seeing them as commodities and products for our voracious consumption, built for abstract users by abstract workers, constantly, indiscriminately, freely, and sometimes quite violently extracting natural resources for the production of urban infrastructure and buildings, many of which will never be inhabited and therefore shall later, in a glimpse of an eye, be demolished, beginning the cycle once again: extraction, construction, abandonment, and demolition. The women I have just introduced understand much too well that we need to stop our extractive practices and seek the resources that are already in our cities, not only the underused sites and the materials that will otherwise go to waste, but also the human resources, energies, creativities, knowledges, and capacities to learn, transform, and reinvent the city more after our heart's desires. Our cities must be able to provide the basic necessities for its inhabitants, but this endeavor need not be undertaken by huge international corporations. Huerto Tlatelolco teaches us it can be done locally with different forms of governmental support, helping create a cycle of production and reproduction of knowledge to be exported to other communities, and in doing so, constructing life projects and spaces that are socially and personally meaningful. And collective and meaningful spaces can and should be co-constructed. Therefore, the need to strengthen our public spheres. One way is by means of public urban spaces that, as Veronica told us, enable collective care and action, socialization, and encourage mutual aid links, not divisive and inert public spaces that reflect and reproduce power structures. Another way to strengthen our public spheres was exemplified in Casa Taft 169 and their determination on organizing the community and getting them involved, not only to transform the material urban infrastructure, but as Marina told me, to transform the legal and democratic infrastructure as well. I might not have made it explicit in all cases, but in all of them, these women and the people they collaborate with are constantly researching and learning about their sites of action. This brings me directly to the work of Taller Creando Sin Encargos and their emphasis on integrating students to their actions. As an architect and a lecturer myself in a school of architecture, I think it is important to change the way schools of architecture and planning continue to produce knowledge, often completely isolated from other disciplines and communities, constantly rewarding individual performance and continuously feeding and reproducing the same neoliberal system, the growth system, where we are taught how to talk to our clients. And let me just tell you my little story. Back at home, one of my first tasks as an architectural student was to decontextualize an object. In a country such as Mexico, where more than half of the population live in informal settlements and precarious conditions, in a country with a dubious democratic system and where human rights are constantly violated, I was being taught not to see what is there, to ignore the context that we have so carelessly constructed. But I want to end with a positive note and to conclude my conversation with Marina, she told me, I know about projects that have contacted us from the east, from the west, from the north, from the south, and from central Puerto Rico. I aspire that one day our little country will define itself and take charge of its future with real autonomy, and I see the possibility in the small things happening here. Deep down, we knew that Casa Taft was something more ambitious than rehabilitating a public nuance. Things do not have to be extraordinary to really be the seed of profound transformation. Thank you very much.
Wow, Dalia, this was a really, really interesting and empowering presentation. Really glad, thank you. I have to recover. Our third and last speaker is Paul Chatterton. He will bring, after Dalia's presentation, other types of concrete strategies to exit the growth paradigm ingrained in our cities and move towards decarbonized and convivial cities. So Paul is a writer, researcher, and campaigner. He's professor of urban futures in the School of Geography at the University of Leeds. He's currently director of the university's Sustainable Cities Group, which has launched the groundbreaking MSc Sustainable Cities. Paul is also co-founder and resident of the award-winning low-impact housing cooperative Lilac. I hope I pronounce it well. He has gone forward to help set up Leeds community homes to help promote community-led housing. His recent books include Low Impact Living and Unlocking Sustainable Cities. He's also a co-founder of the public charity Antipod, dedicated to research and scholarship in radical geography, and an associate editor of the journal City. Please, Paul, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, and thank you for some great inspiring kind of examples there from Kim and Dalia, which really set the context for what degrowth can mean in practice. So I've been listening with great attention for some wonderful examples and the great variety from both Europe and Latin America there, but really bringing to life some of the challenges and prospects that we face, right, in terms of building degrowth into a practical urban policy agenda, right, which can transform our lives for the better. So I'm going to share my screen with you for my presentation. What I'm going to talk about is I'm going to really focus on a number of things coming together through which we can start to articulate what degrowth, or what I'm calling post-growth, might mean in practice. I want to talk a little bit about growth, capitalism, and the carbon age, in particular, how we tackle not just the capitalist crisis and the social crisis, but the climate crisis, right, as a driver of capitalism. And what does this look like in some terms of practical steps as a radical roadmap for unlocking real sustainability in cities, right? I'm interested in a real kind of significant shift within our lifetime and unlocking a potential, which I think the previous two talks have really illuminated. So for me, it starts with this balance. So a couple of months ago in lockdown, I wrote this article for the academic online platform, The Conversation. I called the kind of lockdown, the coronavirus lockdown, this real-time laboratory of a more sustainable urban future. And what fascinated me was how there's an accumulation of old problems come to light with the addition of the new pandemic crisis, and how the crises have converged for us to take a fresh perspective on how we might go forward and reconfigure our cities in particular to make them more, not just healthy, more sustainable, but start to tell a new story about what a city is for, beyond the old story of growth, right? Because for me, this whole thing's a tipping point, yeah? I mean, on the left side, we've got the old story of growth around globalization, inward investment, financialization, corporate growth, extractive economies, all those key things which we understand as a growth paradigm, yeah? Especially around commodification and closure. Tipping that, how do we tip this to a much more regenerative, cyclical, urban economy based around some of the things I'm going to be exploring, cooperative commons. But one of the interesting things, how do we build a safe economy? Because I think one of the things we've been very aware of is how unsafe our cities have become, not just kind of socially, racially, or otherwise, but in terms of some of the deep reasons for lack of safety in the face of the nature and climate and social emergencies that are coming up. How do we build that local resilience in to building safety over the coming decades? So for me, safety is a key metaphor here. Yeah. And for me, it's about, there's 4 C's that will tip the balance: community resilience, COVID recovery, climate safety, and capitalism, overcoming capitalism. And I'm going to look at different areas of city life in a very high level way before we have a discussion on this. So, community resilience, how do we build capacity and participation, quality of life as a new storyline for our cities? How do we certainly, for this pandemic and for future epidemics, how do we create conditions for safe management now and in the future? And climate safety, I want to return to, because how do we keep momentum on that rapid journey to creating safe levels of global heating, right, which keep within the Paris threshold of 1.5 degrees? And capitalism, how do we start to create the conditions of life beyond enclosure, commodification, and alienation? And I'm gonna have a look at that in a second. Now, I want to just start with just a quick thing on climate safety, because for me, the growth has driven us to a point of deep climate unsafety. I want to foreground this as one of the main effects as we come out of the pandemic of the sources of lack of safety, right? And why the growth paradigm needs to be fundamentally challenged. So we're all familiar, hopefully, with this kind of graph. Current emission line, there's a baseline if we start to do nothing. This is from my city of Leeds, by the way. So Leeds came up with this wonderful roadmap, which is these are carbon emissions going down, and they're starting to flatline. About 4 million tonnes a year you can see Leeds emits. The dotted line is the route to climate safety, to hold global temperatures to within 1.5 degrees. So this is the amount of carbon emission emitted every year in Leeds. It's about 4 million tonnes. You can see if we do nothing, it'll probably much stay at 4 million tonnes. The key thing is to get it down to about 0 by the 2040s. So we are effectively net zero, and that will bring us in line with Paris targets of holding global temperatures 1.5 degrees. This is a massive task, because using all the carbon under that line would be extremely bad. That's a hotter world by 3 or 4 degrees, right? So the key challenge is to not use that red polygon, which represents a massive amount of carbon, our carbon budget. And if that is used at that size, we'll be at a 3 or 4 or 5 degree hotter world. So this is a challenge. The blue bit is our carbon detox. That's a bit we cannot use. And you could replicate this for any large metropolitan area in the world, Rotterdam, Delhi or Melbourne or wherever, right? It's the same kind of emissions profile. We need to get on this zero carbon roadmap. This is our particular carbon budget for Leeds that's left, right? And it's 42 million tonnes. The interesting thing for Leeds, it is 42 million tonnes. And that's our all-time carbon budget. Happy to return to some of this stuff in the questions, because this is really important, because the amount of carbon we're spilling out is directly linked to the growth machine. So if we don't understand the consequences of the growth machine, we're not going to unravel this high carbon dependent urban life. Now, this is a key thing for me. I've extended the graph for a particular reason. If we, going back to this other graph, this graph is 4 million tonnes a year. This is only what we call in-city emissions, production-based emissions, the carbon emissions which happen in a city. Now, if we add on top of that 2 things, aviation and consumerism, the 2 big growth dynamics in our economies, we don't emit 4 million tonnes as a city a year, we emit 14 million tonnes, right? This is the hidden carbon. So the amount of carbon we are using as a city goes off the graph. Therefore, our carbon detox is absolutely massive. Our journey to zero is not a relatively kind of a gentle but fairly steep curve, but a dramatically steep roller coaster down. So this is one of the reasons we have to take degrowth seriously, because of the amount of carbon we have to shut down in our economy in the timescale to avoid 1.5 degree of global warming. So this for me foregrounds everything. This foregrounds a huge task ahead of us to rapidly decarbonize and degrow our economies. And I think very few policymakers have understood the scale of this. For me, actually, this is an agenda for capitalism, anti-capitalism, what I actually call post-capitalism, because it's not just rupturing and smashing capitalism, although that's partly what we'll need to do to take that much carbon out of the economy. It's to build a progressive economy and society after that. So what I did in a recent research article is I said, look, if we're going to talk about post-capitalism, we have to understand what capitalism is. So the left hand of this column, we just sketched out the kind of three main aspects of capitalism. It's a system based on enclosure, it's a system based on alienation and the alienation of work, and it's a system based on commodification, especially the commodification of a relationship between us, but commodifying material goods and the essence of life. Yeah. So if we're going to flip that, so what is the opposite of these three intrinsic characteristics of capitalism? Well, for enclosure, it's the commons. It's a self-management of collective property and the ownership of that collective property. But it's a new form of social relationship which manages those artifacts. Yeah. And instead of alienation, it's doing what John Holloway beautifully called doing, purposeful activity that is not determined by others, which produces use, not exchange value. It's the doing, right? And underpinning that, rather than an economy and a social relationship based on commodification, it's socially useful production. It's creating a socially useful economy where the things that the economy does meet actual material needs and desires that underpin human flourishing. And I think within COVID, we start to see elements of that returning to lots of socially useful production, right? And things like the Green New Deal, Build Back Better campaign have really highlighted what that means in practice. So those for me are three tangible aspects. If we're starting to just say, well, we don't like capitalism, what are the tangible mechanisms which we would use to build that post-capitalist world? Right, so I want to look at, I'm just going to highlight 4 areas for discussion. If we're going to start to degrow cities, there's been some wonderful examples up to now, and they can be kind of grouped into different areas. Certainly about transport, car-free urbanism. It's about building a city commons, which is that socially useful economy. It's about mass city greening, a new relationship with nature. And it's about a completely new approach to energy. So let's have a quick look at these. And for me, there's a twin dynamic. It's about locking down what harms, and it's about unlocking what doesn't harm, what allows us to flourish. And it's this twin dynamic of resistance and creation, which is the engine for me of what degrowth means. Degrowth means resistance and degrowth means creation. So 4 headlines, 4 action areas for urban public policy. The first one is really this car-free city. How do we create car light and car-free urban mobility based on social justice? And it means locking down car culture, and some of the things certainly that have been talked about before in terms of how the growth agenda is perpetuating certain forms of mobility, especially on high-speed mobility. How do we unlock ourselves from car and mobility culture, which is privatized, corporatized, and fossil fuel dependent, right? And the planning system that goes with that. And how do we unlock car-free mobility based around public-owned, employee-owned, mass transit, micro-mobility, and local mobility? There's a wonderful comment earlier. I think we're looking at what we call the 20-minute or 15-minute neighborhood. How do we localize economic life to make certain forms of mobility unnecessary, to eliminate the structural conditions which lock us into corporate fossil fuel dependent mobility? Second area is this, what I call a zero emission city. How do we lock down this aging, centralized, corporate control, carbon intensive energy system, which we're very slowly weaning ourselves off? Okay, we're doing okay, we're starting to get rid of coal, but we're not doing anything fast enough in terms of meeting those very stringent Paris targets, to hold the global temperature to 1.5 degrees. The missing element here is unlocking rapidly distributed energy networks, civic energy revolutions, municipal ownership, zero carbon development, and mass retrofit. I think certainly in Northern Europe, and the UK is not a leader at this. Certainly there's some great stuff coming out of the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden in terms of how we accelerate that shift to zero carbon urban energy. The third one is quite a philosophical challenge, a new city-nature deal. Yeah, this is an existential challenge to us as humans, right? Because we are one of the causes of unsustainability on our planet. And we're really talking about a new relationship, an interspecies relationship, right? Which we currently don't have. And we did see glimpses of that during the COVID lockdown. How do we start to lock down this broad ecosystem degradation? Because remember, this latest pandemic was a zoonotic disease, right? With its origins in the rapid expansion over the last 50 years of human development across the world, which has brought humans into contact with pristine ecosystems in a rapid and hitherto unknown way, which has led to the spread cross-contamination of diseases between species, right? And that's the potential future of pandemic scenarios. So we have to look at our human development model and how it's fundamentally flawed. So on a city scale, how do we create that new deal with nature, that rewilding, restoration, reconnection? So this is not just about more green spaces. This is a fundamentally new deal for nature within city policy and city metrics. And last area, which I think drives them all, how do we create a new city commonwealth which would underpin all the other stuff and actually pay for and resource all the other stuff? How do we lock down that poor planning system, excessive corporate control, and start to get money to circulate within community economies, building community wealth and community democracy, showing some of the examples we've seen in the previous interventions, which would fund climate safe and local resilient interventions which will disrupt the status quo and start to build fragments of degrowth in action. Because there's a huge amount of wealth locked in there, we need to start to recirculate it within community commons, capture it and recirculate that wealth within community commons. So there's some stuff to be done here. For me, I like to think as a geographer, think about at different levels. There needs to be significant reform within the big state, changes at tax, land reform, voting, welfare, and metrics, right? A whole bunch of stuff at that macro level. At the grassroots, we've seen some fantastic innovation, and that needs resourcing. For me, what's missing in terms of making degrowth work is this civic middle, this middle bit. So there's the state and there's grassroots, it's the middle bit, what I call the civic middle. It's the community cooperatives, it's the city-owned energy companies, it's the participatory budgeting mechanisms, which would happen at the city region scale that can start to pull resources down from the nation state and then enable those grassroots experiments. So it's that glue in the middle, which we are currently missing. And therefore the whole system of innovation between state and civil society is not working. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Lots of ideas, and I'm looking forward to picking them up in the discussion. So thank you very much. And that's the book I mentioned as well. Oh, it's gone now, but the Unlocking Sustainable Cities book, which picks up a lot of these ideas. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was really enlightening, and I think that you really complement each other in your presentations, and I think it lays a really good basis for the discussion. And so before starting with the questions from the audience, I would like to give you three the opportunity to briefly comment on each other's input. And if you have questions for each other, feel free also to ask them. Who would like to start?
I can, I don't mind either way. Thanks everyone for your presentations and for great moderation as well. I was, all very, very inspiring. I was wondering about many things. I think part of the great thing about this topic of degrowth is that it really makes us think, try to think out of the box. And one thing that always comes up in me is also kind of trying to see, okay, so why, for example, in Dalia's, in your presentation, why don't we have more of this? And for example, also in Europe, I don't know, or maybe we do. And I was wondering, maybe you can elaborate on how you found these people, and a bit also on how do they manage to sustain themselves doing that, because I think that one reason why I'm not out there doing that is that I don't know how to sustain my lifestyle, and maybe a less fancy lifestyle, but a life in any case, while doing such a thing. So I find that would be really interesting, and I'm very curious, Paul, about the ideas you've got about COVID and how that might play out for the future. I think perhaps we could discuss more about what safety means in that sense, because safety triggers for me a lot of state regulation kind of stuff. Is that what we have in mind, or is it something very different? Yeah, sorry.
Should I answer? Yeah.
Yeah, Dalia, go ahead.
Okay, first, I basically found them like looking in the web, just looking keywords abandoned and maybe art or something like this. But then it became really interesting because then I started to interview who I was finding, and I would ask them at the end if they could share other projects, and it became really interesting in Puerto Rico because they could share more than one, more than three, and as I kind of tried to hint there, they are connected, their projects, they work together. And to the point that I'm not sure, but I even would say that it's starting to be kind of a movement, like a resistance movement in Puerto Rico. It's not the same in the others. And also I also had this question, how do they sustain themselves? And they, not all of them sustain themselves. For example, Huerto Tlatelolco has managed to do that. They have created this civil association, but then they also had to create a company so that they could sell products to restaurants. But they do organize events that are they're not the typical like, we organize a community event. They organize events in big, or let's say, in restaurants, in kind of fancy restaurants that buy organic products to make money. So they do go, they still go within the system to kind of sustain themselves and continue the project. But in the case, for example, of Casa Taft, she also kind of lives up this project through funding, so through finding alliances that she can become kind of the coordinator of the project. So there's these others, but the others then have some sort of other work that they do parallel to this. So it is kind of in their hobby free time.
Paul, would you like to react to Kim's question about safety?
Yeah, it's a good one to pursue actually, and I'm looking forward to talking more about that, especially with the listeners. And but just to comment on the other talks first, I just found the examples from Mexico and Argentina just really illuminating, and this narrative of abandonment is super important in terms of, but for me the geography of abandonment is really important, how that works within city, but also within countries and within the whole global world system, yeah, and how large parts of the world or large parts of our cities are being abandoned, actively underdeveloped, to extract wealth, extract capital from them. And I think one of the key things is, how do we get that? How do we create mechanisms which will connect some of the people you've been researching so they can more effectively create their own cycle of flourishing? Because the opposite of abandonment is not just growth, right? It's a new form of community flourishing, yeah. And how do we capture that surplus capital and connect those people to allow them to do that? And I think that for me is really key. And abandonment is a really fascinating metaphor, especially abandonment goes quite closely with enclosure, and how, as we face crises, we enclose and we also abandon. So I'd like to know more. I'd like to watch that more of that, because we're not so familiar with that in in maybe this corner of Europe, but there's certainly more kind of global south urban centres are really clear on what abandonment means. On the safety thing, yeah, I mean, again, safety is a commodity which is in short supply, right? And it's very uneven. So some places are very safe, and other places are just never been safe, right? And I think safety is a good, a public good, which we need to more equitably distribute across the world. And the question is, who will keep us safe, right? So is it the state, is it the market, or is it civil society, or is it some combination? Because we know that if you live in Finland, you know what keeps you safe, right? But if you live in Mexico City, you know what keeps you safe. But what combination will keep us safe in the future? How do we reclaim the state to keep us more safe, but also build mutual aid networks at the grassroots, which will enhance community safety when the state abandons us? So I think degrowth really asks us to think about future safety and future resilience as well, because as aspects of the economy fragment, which used to be stable, then there's going to be new areas of lack of safety as well emerge.
Thank you, Paul. Dalia, do you have any question to Kim or Paul, or any reflection after what Paul and Kim just said?
Well, just that I find the talks really, really interesting, and that I had never really thought through this degrowth lens about even these projects, and these talks have really given like new meaning to those projects, I think. And I think I hope that the activists are hearing what you guys are saying, and then reflecting on their own projects. And I wanted to say something that I also found interesting in Puerto Rico is that they have now, I'm not sure if she's already the governor or she's running for governor right now, but they had a mayor that was really supporting these projects. And it's not, these are, could only pick 4, but she is trying to find mechanisms that this can be further developed, that people have more of a say of how to again be able to obtain these abandoned spaces. But I also think that this indiscriminate production of spaces has to stop. There we have zero, like you've shown, Paul, we have zero time to continue our way of producing buildings, zero time. And that kind of makes me, I guess my question to you both is, how do we sleep comfortably at night when we know what we know, and how cities are being produced and there's no stop? I don't even see it with the COVID-19, I have to confess, that anything is going to change. I'm very sad.
Okay, you're completely right, Dalia. If you don't have any further comment, I think we can look through the questions that are arriving from the audience. I think that there is a question that can be directed to you, Dalia, but I'm sure Kim and Paul, you also have a take on this. That is concerning the rural-urban divide, and how do you see this divide? Cities tend to exploit nearby rural areas. How to create less colonial relations between both, and is this divide useful at this point? I think that it relates a little bit to what we were discussing somehow, the use of space and the appropriation of space also. Does anyone want to take this one?
I just wanted to say, like, because also it was commented before that maybe that there are not this kind of systemic abandonment in Europe, and I think it has this maybe a little similarity with the rural-urban divide. How rural Latin America was really kind of there was this push effect, so that people would migrate to cities, but then their needs were also not met, and then of course, and in Europe there was the shrinking city, and that is also a form of systemic abandonment. I think you can correct me, but many cities were abandoned also because of the growth paradigm, because of economic growth elsewhere. So there was this kind of push of people towards urban centers because we should live more happily and with more, of course, have everything that we want, or our dreams will come true there. And I don't know if that's true. And I think that I don't know, I don't want to say let's go all back to rural, but I think we have to start to think, for me, I think we have to start to think more small scale, and regardless of where we are. And yeah, I don't know.
Kim or Paul, would you like to complete on Dalia's answer about the scale and the divide between the rural and the urban with degrowth lenses?
Well, I can just say briefly that I think it's definitely a good question to explore further. I think there is in degrowth a strong kind of discussion about eco-villages, for example, people trying to go back to living in a more connected way between nature, basically, and what we see as a more rural kind of living and more urban elements, and in a way basically rejecting some of the urban in that, because of course cities, by concentrating everything, people, goods, transport, everything, they require a lot of resources that actually need to also be coming from the rural areas. And there's a certain level of rejection of that, but there is also a strong kind of insight of saying, okay, but cities can also be the place where we can make things more efficient, because we're all together and we can use less energy, for example, to than if we had to spread it out all over. And there are several articles, actually some that I've also put in the resources of the of my presentation, which show a bit how planning lenses can actually help to demystify a bit this idea of something like eco-villages. Jin Shui mentioned it in particular, how eco-villages are not necessarily that good a solution in general. So you really have to think also about the benefits of centralization in relation to to trying to minimize the use of resources, for example, and these kinds of things. So I think that's something to not simply say, okay, let's all go rural or let's all go urban, but let's think a bit more about the consequences of each.
Yeah. Thank you, Kim. Paul, I think there's a question for you that is quite general, but I think it can be interesting. That says, life in degrowth can be too radical for most people. How can we avoid leaving people behind?
So I think we've got to make some incremental urban policy choices which start to build towards that agenda. But I think they need to be contained within a new story, right? The kind of thing that Kate Raworth is doing in Amsterdam, you know, like how could a city have a new sense of itself, right? What is the point of a city? What is the point of the town that you live in, right? What is it for, fundamentally? And I think that is the basis of a democratic debate amongst people that live in that place. And then once you've got that new storyline, you can start to build small public policy choices that make that story come alive. Yeah, we call them, you know, non-reformist reforms. So they're small things, but they're building towards a big picture. Yeah, so we start to do socially useful businesses. We start to put assets into community ownership. We start to change tax systems, and we do this incrementally. And we test and learn, and we go on that way. Otherwise, you know, because we're not even sure ourselves what the implications of our actions will be. But we know we have to do this fairly quickly because of the, we don't have, we've got to act because of the short amount of time we've got before we use up our carbon budget, and then we need to be net zero by the time we've done that. Yeah, and we know that from the other question, we have a rapidly expanding urban world, especially in the global south, rapidly expanding peri-urban areas, which are being driven by consumerism mainly in the global north and the growth of aviation, right? So we have to reflect on what is a good life in the north, because it's generating a particular model of urban growth in the global south, in the majority world.
Dalia, yeah.
I also think a little bit about this question about it being too radical and leaving people behind. And I think maybe then we have not done our job right to explain actually how capitalism and the growth paradigm has left so many people behind, so many and not even only in the, let's say, so-called global south. We see it now happening, like very visible in, I guess we saw it in 2007, 2008 in Spain, and then we saw it again. Of course, we saw it before and so many times, and then now we're seeing it like kind of live happening in the United States. We're seeing in these kind of, let's say, very fast growing and strong economies, we see how people are left behind. And I think actually we need to be really radical so that we can attain change quite fast.
Yeah. So you talk about aiming at change quite fast. I heard Paul also referring to the climate crisis and the need to go faster. And there's a question, I think, that links to this monitoring of time somehow, that is about the smart cities. And the question is, smart cities are designed to commodify data, time, processes. These go against human-centered participatory models. How can we decolonize this drive? Kim, would you like to start with this question?
Sure, I can try. I think it's a very challenging question. I think it's a very good question, because I think both the issue of time and definitely the issue of smart cities has to be looked at much more carefully than we have been used to. I think in terms of smart cities, I think they are, from my perspective, really a completely part of the growth machine. And if you look at the schemes I presented, complex as they look, it was really, you really see the issue of innovation and of commodifying things and of creating competitions to see which smart gadgets and things are going to make things work the best. And in the end, I really doubt that is going to benefit anybody except big tech, basically. And I think because in the end it feeds off people who think that they're doing things for free because they are online, for example, and instead they're paying with their data, which they will never be able to retrieve. So I find that all pretty complex. I do, of course, see that technologies can make life much better in many ways. So I don't deny that. We are here able to discuss thanks to it. But I think it needs to be looked at critically. And I think in terms of time, again, high tech, high speed, I think I completely agree that we are running out of time in many ways. And yet, by not stopping to think, we are basically, I think, sometimes over-accelerating ourselves and making solutions, supposed solutions, don't actually have the effect that we would like, or don't lead to the outcomes that we expect, or only less than something else might have if we had stopped to think longer. And I think there's actually a book, I don't know if I have it here, I can't find it, but There's a great book about from Hartmut Rosa. I don't know if everyone knows it, which is about the good life without growth, and well, edited by him and the co-author. And I really explore also the idea of social acceleration being very problematic because it really limits us in many ways. So I think, yes, we need to think about time. We need to think about these carbon issues, but I think we should not fall into the trap of not allowing that to let us stop and think. And for example, in the case of COVID, I think an important thing to think about is, yes, maybe there's an impact in terms of emissions from airplanes, which is positive, and totally agree with that. At the same time, how many masks are being thrown into the ocean? How many gloves are being produced with, plastic gloves, which have to be produced somewhere and which probably, give off CO2 when they are produced in that sense. So I think there's a lot more to think about than just aviation and CO2 in terms of trying to save the environment in a way that is meaningful to us. But it's a start. So let's be honest about that as well. Sorry.
Thanks. Thank you, Kim. Paul, do you have a comment on this one as well, on this question about time?
I think the smart city agenda is really fascinating because there are two smart cities, right? There's the corporate smart city and there's a cooperative smart city. And what I'm really interested in is the degrowth. Bedrock for degrowth really is constituted through a constellation of platform cooperatives. Yeah, Lumio, Fairmondo, Fair Co-op, who are all emerging to challenge Uber and Airbnb, right, and Amazon. And I think this is the smart city that I believe in, right? It's basically people who are hacking the internet, creating member cooperatives on the internet, right? So for me, that's a smart city. And there's, technology can be enabling, right? So, I think there's a lot of really progressive kind of hackers and cyberbunks and kind of hack labbers out there who are trying to build an alternative infrastructure which will underpin our well-being in the future. So smashing the corporate platforms, replacing them with cooperative platforms. So there's another smart city.
All right. Unless Dalia, you want to jump on this one, I think we can go to the next question. That is really important, and we discussed it briefly already when we were preparing this talk. That is how the debate on degrowth in cities should address systemic racism, and what does the Black Lives Matter movement teach us? Dalia, maybe? You're muted.
Yeah, I think I have to think a little bit if someone else wants to go first.
Shall I repeat the question, maybe?
No. Should I? I mean, Kim, do you
copy paste it in the chat so you can read it?
Paul, I think if you have some immediate thoughts.
Yeah. So I mean, this is fundamental to any response, isn't it? It will be climate, building climate movement, building degrowth movement, and I think we've got to look long hard at the kind of movements and participatory strategies we're building. So just like the climate movement needs to be fundamentally anti-racist, so does a degrowth movement. And how do we build anti-racist policies and anti-racist institutions? Yeah, and that's really, really structurally fundamental. And equally, there's important kind of age elements here that the youth strike over the last 18 months has brought to the fore. And for me, fundamentally, I think what cuts across all these issues is how do we fundamentally change the structural nature of decision making, right, in cities? Look at all the thousands of decisions that get made every day in a typical metropolitan area, right, within public and private institutions. How do we change those? Because for me, fundamentally, it's about how resources get allocated. Yeah. because the allocation of resources has material effects on energy, buildings, transport, housing, or whatever, yeah, and you know, the justice system or whatever you're looking at. So we need to break down and fundamentally change how decisions are made. Not in a tokenistic participatory way, just to make sure there's diversity there, but to make sure take people through a process of popular education, so we know the history of our localities and the inequalities that locality is based upon, and make decisions which structurally alter those historic inequalities, be they racial, gender, age-based, or class, or whatever, yeah? And that's the key. And then create coalitions of civil society actors across those who are going to take meaningful actions to defend those gains, right? And are prepared to take to the streets to do that. That's a big agenda, right?
I think it's a huge agenda. I think completely agree on those points. I do think systemic racism and degrowth go very well in terms of addressing systemic racism. I think they go very well together. I'm trying to think as I speak, because I find it an extremely challenging question. I don't think that degrowth immediately can address this, but I do think that degrowth is about providing a reality that is, or providing alternatives, multiple ones, that can be informed by indeed context, so recontextualizing things, and by trying to understand that when we rethink what reality we want, what cities we want, we need to include in that everyone, and that needs to be including Blacks and whoever else, everyone. And indeed it needs to cut across all people that are in that context, and it needs to it can't basically deny the historical roots of inequalities on one end. On the other hand, there needs to be, so there needs therefore to be an active engagement with that, but there might also need to be a kind of moment in which you say, okay, let's try to think a reality in which we then hope to get to, in which those inequalities are not perpetuated. And I find that very, very difficult. But I don't think degrowth in itself provides the answer to that. I think it needs to work to integrate that when it works on contextualizing the alternative that will be implemented in each location specifically, because racism looks very different across the world. It's there everywhere, but it looks very different, and we need to think about that.
Thank you, Kim, for your contribution.
I would like to just also comment. I do think, in a way, if we see it more in also maybe a global scale, that's why I found it hard just with the cases or with the situation in the United States. But if we start to understand, like Kim said, to contextualize and to learn where, for example, where things are coming from, and I kind of touched upon this in the talk, but there are very violent extractions going on elsewhere that we just don't see to produce, I don't know, some thing here back home, let's say. So these, I also think, are forms of some sort of supremacy, or, you know, these colonial practices are also continue to be very racist and damaging to both societies and the environment. So in a way, I guess, when, of course, I think I'm not like a professional of degrowth and a theorist of degrowth, but I think in part it could happen by default, and I also think it has to be like more and more implemented in when we think about cities and planning, to understand where things are coming from and how those things, we are getting to those things. And so, yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I think that, Paul, there is a question that relates to community housing. So since you're a member of the cooperative housing, maybe there's a difference, by the way, between community housing and cooperative housing, and then you can make it clear. But there's a question that is, how do we integrate the poorest groups of the population or new migrants in community housing? They may not be able to afford it financially. If you'd like to start with this question.
Great, and I think the way to do that is through the ownership of land, because communities can provide housing, generate their own self-managed housing, but they can do that for low-income groups and new arrivals in cities if the municipality will provide land at nil cost, at no cost, on which cooperatives or other self-managed housing providers can build housing, because it's the cost of land which is prohibitive, right? It's the cost of land which creates uneven housing markets. So that's why we need to have the coalitions between community activists and the state, because the state has resources like land, and then we can start to create decent housing, not just for city residents, but for incoming migrants and low-income workers, seasonal workers, those kinds of stuff. Yeah. So then we start to undo the kind of, the ghettoization of our cities. So for me, it's all about land. And one of the big things, of course, here is land reform and shifting tax from income to land. So some kind of land tax, which would then allow us to recycle land, because people would get rid of land if it was taxed. And then that could be devolved into community land trusts.
Kim or Dalia, would you like to complete Paul's answer?
I think there's not that much to say, but I was just thinking that there again, a bit of the contextual question comes in, because land is managed very differently across the world as well, right? And I am not an expert at all on this, but I do know that especially in Latin America, from what I know, the way that land is dealt with via government / corporations and landowners much more individually, I think, or at different scales. You have corporations that then own the land and so on. And I think in Europe, across Europe, you also have very different ways. And I think there again, it goes to show that this application of these questions really needs to look into what the local context is. Boring as that answer is, sorry.
I will comment because because exactly, I think Latin America is a good example in both ways, and actually Mexico, and I add more into the links of resources, but Mexico did have a land reform, and after a revolution, and it did end up in this kind of community-owned land. And of course, this was completely dismantled in the 1980s or 90s, maybe, with the neoliberal system. And there are examples exactly of how, I can't remember because it's long ago that I read about this, but that they were doing community housing collaboration, like the state supported that people did their own housing in community, not like self-building like you would do maybe in an informal settlement, but really as a community, you would construct these housing complexes. And I can add something to the resources about that, because I think it's a good example, but of course it was completely dismantled.
Thank you.
I don't know if I may add one small thing. You just triggered this in me, Dalia. Speaking of self-building, there is a lot of work on self-building in the Netherlands, which is extremely regulated by the state. And I know of a project in which there was actually an exploration of looking into how self-build is understood in the Netherlands versus in Brazil, and basically contrasting favela self-build with extremely regulated and formalized kind of self-build for in a context like the Netherlands. And this at the University of Amsterdam, this together with the Universidade de São Paulo. And what you see is that really this is obviously not comparable, but it's in many ways you can compare anything. But what's interesting is that in both these extremely different contexts, you have such a thing as self-build, and it is being employed to try to understand how we might, for example, use energy efficiency, while at the same time in Brazil, well, all you're trying to do is tap some electricity from somewhere in a favela. So there's really interesting questions when you look at self-build, for example, in terms of land and these kinds of things.
Okay, thank you very much, Kim and Dalia and Paul, for this really nice exchange. I think it's time now to slowly wrap up. If you're okay with this, I will try to mash up the last two questions and invite you to try to mix in your answers, because I would like you to share your main takeaway from this discussion and maybe final words, and try to add in your answer, what is your vision for this post-COVID world that we will enter, I don't know, soon, hopefully. What do you think? There's a question that was asked for you, Dalia, but I think you can all answer. Will the post-COVID-19 period see shrinking cities? And then someone else asked, can we counteract commodification and monetization in the future by championing the care economy and feminist economies? So what's your vision of a future post-COVID world? Please feel free to answer.
Okay. First of all, I'm in Finland, and it is kind of a little bit like a post-COVID already, because everything is already opened, I think. And my kid has been already a month going to her daycare and so forth. So, and I don't see much change. Like, I think I talked with you about like seeing how there were lines in McDonald's while very small cafes or shops were closed. No, so during the COVID lockdown of let's say spaces of consumption, if you will, and offices and so forth, but it wasn't really this tough lockdown like elsewhere. And so that kind of yeah, I don't know, it kind of struck me that maybe, no, I don't want to be negative, there has to be something positive, so maybe I go away from that, but yeah, I wish that we would see that things that we thought were unthinkable happen. I hope that people had a time to see how accelerated our lives were, even if they're not super accelerated as other people, but that we kind of had time to rethink and revalue what is very important and basic for us. And then invite you, I don't know what to answer about the shrinking city, but in our nice kind of feminist blog, a person wrote, one of the people who wrote a story, a fictitious short story about her, how she envisioned the cities would start, because people were now able to work from home, that people would then return to these smaller towns where they would be probably more in and closer or more proximity to nature and so forth. And this would, and then like kind of from that, it had started to evolve into like, then some shops would start to come back because they're working there now and they need somewhere to eat and blah, blah, blah. And it kind of created a narrative around the shrinking European city. So I invite you to take a look at that. And yeah, I don't take more.
Paul?
I
mean, there might be some interesting, like a new story of geography, right? Around if social distancing is with us for a while, then we have got an interesting kind of new social and spatial arrangement, right? There might be a bit of de-densification going on. People a bit reluctant to build dense areas, you know. So there's in UK and certainly other countries, you know, there's this big push for more green space. We might get a big push for community housing, which has green space built in, and natural surveillance and community spaces. So that might be really positive. There's going to be a really big push for active travel, because in the next 6 months, there's going to be a reluctance to get on buses and trams, right? And trains. Therefore, if all those journeys are made by cars instead, there'll be gridlock and cities won't work. So we need to have a big shift to bikes and walking. And what that means is localization. So I think the big benefit out of COVID would to relocalize life. Yeah, and that might mean stopping some aspects of globalization, flying. So we can cut back on some of the excessive flying, but also the big thing, we need to revalue what's important. So reducing consumer expenditure and relocalizing the economy. I can't see that happening, although that would be the best gain we could have from COVID, because it would directly affect carbon emissions over a longer cycle. But I think really what's going to happen, unfortunately, is there's going to be a desire to bounce the economy back really strongly. And the quickest and easiest way to do that is through fossil fuel-based developments, right? So I think we're going to see that, especially in the majority world, especially in Asia, Latin America, Africa. There's going to be a desire to see more structural lending, more kind of like infrastructure projects, highways, that kind of stuff, energy systems. So I think we're going to see a bit of a fossil fuel bounce back, which will wipe out any gains from COVID, but might push us even a bit quicker towards the end of our carbon budget as a globe. So the balance sheet is good and bad. I'm not really sure which way it's going to go. I can only suggest that we use this opportunity to bring together the degrowth agenda and the COVID recovery agenda and push for a just recovery, a just degrowth agenda, and really like start to tell that story about what a positive future could be. Because my final point is that this will only work if we can tell a really beautiful story about what our places can be and how they will be better in a degrowth world and a COVID recovered world.
Thank you, Paul, for these beautiful words. Kim, would you like to close with final words as well?
Thanks. I won't be able to best that, but I'd like to just say that for me, a main takeaway is really that there's a lot of inspiring stuff out there happening. Again, it's kind of a reminder of that. You kind of know it, but then when you see examples again, it really helps. And I think that one thing that I realized from both presentations is so Paul mentioned the civil middle being what's civic middle, sorry, which is what's missing, and I think that's something very worthwhile exploring. And then in relation to Dalia's presentation, I was wondering. Thinking, you know, so there's all these great initiatives out there which are more on the grassroots level in a way, and I don't believe that they need to be scaled up in which is what happens in the growth logic, right? You need to multiply the thing so that it shows its merit. I don't think that should be the case, but I do think that those initiatives can be inspiring for, and as well in terms of their joint, working together, that they show that there is a chance to have initiatives all over that can inspire each other and also strengthen each other in the lessons that they learn in how they can deal with managing their life and implementing such things, etc. And that perhaps then there you can try to find a link between those grassroots things and a civic middle. And I really wonder where that is, but I think it's worthwhile exploring. So it's something to put on the future agenda. I think and here I would say it would be really great if we could find ways to reconnect as well between planning and geography, and planning and degrowth, and geography and degrowth and all of that, because I think that one thing that I've been finding very, very interesting to follow is that over the past 2 years or so, more and more publications on degrowth have been coming out, but they remain in a very narrow arena of journals, for example, that are willing to publish material on this academically, and also probably beyond the academic realm, which I'm a bit less familiar. And I think that that could be something really to try and challenge at a personal level almost, and to try to explore how planning journals and geography journals and more degrowth or economics journals can kind of help each other to try and see, okay, these things overlap. There's a long kind of tension between the idea of planning and geography. I learned both when I went to do my bachelor's, and I find it a shame that there is that division. And I think those things could be brought back together a bit to kind of try to at least provide really a platform in which these things can be explored and can be brought out there for more people to be thinking about them together and to find solutions to these answers. So I hope that this talk can kind of contribute to that in a way.
Yeah, I hope your voice will be heard, Kim. And yeah, well, thank you very much for joining today. It was really an amazing discussion. So I'd like to thank the audience for watching us and asking those great questions. I hope you all found answers and hopefully more questions. So don't hesitate to dig into the resources that the speakers provided in the description of the talk. Also, thanks a lot again to Lorenzo, Gabby, and Oksana for their wonderful job off screen. And last but not least, I would like to remind you that next week, on Tuesday, the 30th of June, we will hold the last session of our spring-summer season of Degrowth Talks. So it's going to be beautiful as well, because we will discuss how we can use the power of art and imagination to create alternative futures. Thank you very much for participating, and yeah, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.